episode of Rounding the Makes, Making the Rounds. Did you want to know, by the way, on Spotify, apparently we're competing with a podcast, all right, also called Making the Rounds. Do you know what the
Really?
podcast is about? I want to hear your
No.
best guess.
Oh God. I feel like it's either a really terrible pun, like it's like a donut podcast or something. Or what is rounds outside of like competition? I feel like it has to be a really bad pun on some sort of food.
On some sort of food, okay, best guess. It's about medical rounds. So making the
Oh, okay.
rounds. Yeah. So it's
All
a
right.
medical
Okay.
podcast. Obviously, we are far more insightful and educational than doctors who do rounds, and therefore our podcast is infinitely more popular.
Oh
Both
my
of
God.
those are false. But anyway, thank you for joining us today on Making the Rounds. Yes, we are on Spotify, and that is a thing that happens. So you can check us out on Spotify. I always post the YouTube link and the Spotify link when it goes on Twitter, though I know some of you then tell me, Kelsey, why would I go on Twitter? And that is an excellent question. I don't have a good answer for
That's a
you.
good question.
So anyway, we will get right into the show. Hopefully a fun one. We are not sure when we're exactly going to do a follow-up because of various logistics of things that occur. But starting off right away, we had the LCS viewership report with the tagline, greatest viewership in the history of LCS. Growth. Growth. We have to stipulate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think any, like, I guess, what are your thoughts on that from the broadcast side?
I mean, obviously, so like whenever viewership is discussed, the first thing, and I'm gonna repeat a lot of things that I have said internally in meetings ad nauseum. So hopefully it doesn't come across as like I feel like I repeat it a lot sometimes in my language here and elsewhere. So hopefully it doesn't come across as too repetitive. But from a really broad perspective, I feel like anytime viewership is down or viewership is struggling, the initial thing is to look at and be like, change the broadcast, change something about the broadcast, about the way you're presenting things, the way the broadcast is working, format changes. Like this can be anything from broadcast content to format changes to personnel changes, anything like that, right? And since I joined in 2021, we have not had a stable broadcast from year to year, which is not. And again, this is my perception about the broadcast prior to 2021, but it seemed very stable, right? In terms of presentation, in terms of what people were doing on broadcast. And the thing that's been most interesting to me in watching like sentiment versus broadcast like content is that even last year, I felt like sentiment around the broadcast was at least the best it's ever been when I've been a part of the broadcast. People were like interacting with the actual content on broadcast a lot more. And then a lot of those changes were then brought into this year, and just in terms of more modular content, like we're doing a skit here, or we're doing like, are you smarter than, or we're doing, XYZ, Mark is doing catching up with double lift, all that stuff. It was pretty much just skits that we, and a lot of more pre-taped stuff that we would slot in depending on like what team was playing, what players were playing, to really try to open up player personalities to the rest of the LCS fans. And so I think actually a lot of things in terms of broadcast content that you're seeing this year actually started last year. And then I also think my experience on broadcast is that the actual viewership numbers, in my opinion, have comparatively little to do with what is actually on the broadcast a lot of the times. Like as compared to extenuating factors, right? So obviously a lot of the stuff that was presented in this thing is like viewership increase from last year, because last year we gutted our own viewership by putting things on weekdays. And then we also had the walkout at the beginning of Summer Split, which also like dramatically affected viewership. So obviously I know a lot of people have already gone through and broken down the numbers and are like, here's how the percentage of what co-streamers are taking, and here's what the percentage of non-North American co-streamers are taking, and here is what here's how that's bad actually, because we don't know what that's going to do to try to bring in more like North American viewers. And to kind of bring this rambling thing to somewhat of a closure, I think the problem facing the LCS going forward, that like we haven't been able to overcome, and I don't know how you overcome it, is that League of Legends just is not culturally relevant in the US. And like, so that's the first factor. And then the second factor is a lot of times when people become like really emotionally invested in players, and those players leave the scene, so like Doublelift, like Bjergsen, for example, there actually is a significant viewership drop off in terms of people just tune out because their favorite player is no longer there. To use another example, outside of LCS, I do know that the viewership of LPL dropped when Uzi was not playing, right? Versus when Uzi was playing. Like, I think there will be, and you can already see it in non-T1 games and T1 games in terms of viewership in LCK, right? Because people want to tune in to see Faker. I think the issues surrounding LCS viewership going forward are going to be that League is not culturally relevant in the US anymore. The reasons for people from other regions to watch LCS outside of entertainment, because we don't usually do well at international competitions, aren't there, which is why I thought the live patch and pre-recorded drafts was actually pretty smart, because it gives you another small reason to watch, right? You can see people playing on live patch, the patch that you are on in solo queue. You can see drafts already like getting in where the actual gameplay is the majority of the broadcast. But yeah, I mean, that's like my perspective from an actual broadcaster, because it's really difficult for me sometimes to feel like stuff that I'm doing, whether I feel good or bad about the content that I'm putting out. I actually don't really feel bad about any content I put out on broadcast.
That's
But
a lie. You feel bad
like
about everything you put out.
that's true. It could be. It could be better. It could be better. But not from a like, oh man, like that was shit. That should never be on broadcast again, right? It's more of a like, I could improve X, Y, Z. But that's just me. That's just my fucking brain. But I think like that is the most frustrating thing, because a lot of times it feels really insurmountable, because I can be like, here's what I would do to reach out. And I know we're going to talk about the CLOL stuff, right? Like here's what I would do to reach out, or here's what I would have done 10 years ago to try to make it so that League is more culturally relevant from like a grassroots perspective, that maybe would have helped then have important players that people really want to latch onto to then follow into this kind of new era of League. I think the closest thing we've had to that in recent years was the Houston finals with EG, with Danny and JoJo. People really latched on to those two players. And obviously that, there have been some things that have happened since then. But like, I think that is another facet where we're taking away the opportunity to have those moments, because we don't do as many road shows anymore. And part of that is because there's not as much viewership and we're not getting as many, partnerships maybe as we did in the past. And like, it all like snowballs together. And I don't really know what else I can say. Like, from my perspective, outside of like, I will just keep trying to do my best on cast, all while knowing that like a lot of things that we do on broadcast actually do not matter in terms of moving the needle on viewership whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, the cynical analysis of this is highest split over split growth. Like, last split had the worst circumstances humanly possible in the history of mankind, which was like, we started late. Suddenly, the schedules were on weekdays, which, based on the growth numbers going from like 2022 summer to 2023 spring, like viewership dropped there as well, because you're going to weekdays. When historically, you are always feel like you get like kind of a bump in spring because more people watch esports in spring because you're not going outside and you're not doing summery things. So it's like from that perspective, like I look at these numbers and I'm thinking, okay, so we got a huge bump by going back to weekends, right? That's the cynical take. I think to be a little less cynical, I actually do think it matters quite a bit in terms of like the type of content you're putting out. Like I guarantee, because I was part of you and I have both been part of like the big pitch to try to make it more player focused, more player personality focused, and to highlight players like significantly more and talk to them on broadcast, like less about the analysis of the game, but more about like, hey, what are you doing on the weekend? Which apparently, the interview where like XU mentioned a girlfriend spawned a content piece for Dig where he had to guess the elo of his girlfriend, and like all of that stuff feeds into each other, right?
Yeah.
So like the when his not knowing it was his girlfriend's games, obviously. But like all of that stuff kind of feeds into each other, creates like fun content, and then you know XU better as like a person, and people want to feel more connected to the individual audiences in like entertainment across the board. That's why you have the cult of celebrity, you have the parasocial phenomenon, you have all the things, whether good or bad. That's just the way it becomes. I think the ultimately, like for me, the big element here is like that still I think had a positive impact on viewership. And I would say the way that you can kind of track that is also in the Academy broadcast, because I would say the content is almost always like focused on personalities, and then they introduced Fearless Draft, which I also think helped considerably. But you see the steady growth even now, basically in NACL viewership over time, even with all the problems with the product. So I do think content itself like does have like a positive impact on viewership counts. But it's like, and I would argue that that probably did have carryover. Like a lot of that emphasis, a lot of building those stories only existed this year because work was done to build them before. And so they became a lot more organic and they feel seamless. And it's like a very lived in broadcast now because so much work was done before, right? So I do think that all of the positive sentiment has also contributed to kind of like the zeitgeist of, oh, hey, like there's this cool thing happening on broadcast. And then suddenly, like Tenebris Gallant said, a lot of people have like a negative sentiment about LCS very publicly, but it's like now you see the sentiment actually changing. And when a public sentiment changes, you're an esports fan, you see a tweet on Twitter, you're more interested in watching like an LCS game now.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting one. The more interesting aspect of this for me is like the co-streaming element. Because obviously, as a broadcaster, you will have the positives and the negatives of your association mentally with co-streamers. But I'm actually very curious from your perspective on like because I don't know if you've watched The Jungle, but Medic had his rant about the effect of the willingness of the broadcast to invest money into the broadcast itself with the success of co-streamers and co-streamers taking a large percentage of viewership. So I'm very curious like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I think the best value from co-streamers, in my opinion, is two things. One, I think, and I know a lot of people like to point to Baiano, the Brazilian streamer doing LCS, as like one of you can tweak it in a negative light where it's like, oh, like he has his fan base, but those are Brazilian viewers, and if you're an advertiser or partner, you might not be looking to advertise to those people. And like advertising and partnerships in a world of co-streamers is like a whole thing that I don't want to open up. But one thing I do like about it is that, and I believe Mark brought this up in the video, is that I think the number one thing that co-streaming can do is that if you know you like either can't afford to do a different language broadcast, or you can't you don't want to put money into it, having someone who you know can stream in Portuguese to Brazilian fans is really important, right? And I think like that's where the value of co-streamers can be used across the board. If you do not have a broadcast for that language and you want to be able to make it available to as many people as possible, I think that is a really cool facet of co-streaming. I also think the other thing that I really like about co-streaming that you can't always do on a cast, and it's something that I have struggled mightily with in trying to become a caster, is you might not have time to go back and look at a wave state, or like you can't rewind the game mid cast, because that is literally not your job. Like it is not your job to be able to do that. Like your job is to present the information in chronological order in the most concise and like digestible way possible, and entertaining way possible too. And so I think co-streamers can offer a lot of value when you can literally like just stop the YouTube video or whatever as you're streaming, go back and be like, "Oh, that's what happened," and then fast forward. And obviously you're still missing pieces of the game, right? So you're not like presenting it in the same way you would an official broadcast. And I think by contrast, the value of the official broadcast is that they are doing that, right? Like they are trying to present everything in a very digestible and easy to understand way as it happens. Um, and I think the frustrating thing, I don't know what Medic's rant was, but I think the frustrating thing is not recognizing what an official broadcast can do for you you when you do already have like I think the for all of the strengths that co-streaming has, the official broadcast also has its own strengths, right? And so if you don't recognize that and you just leave everything to co-streamers, I do think a lot of the stuff, like for example, the player building that you and I were just talking about, that's the thing that you miss, right? So ultimately, the attachment will be to the co-streamer instead of any up and coming players. And I think that can end up having a negative effect as it proliferates, because if you don't get attached to the players and you're looking at how this overall viewership affects, or how co-streamers affect overall viewership, you then end up in a situation where if that streamer is not streaming, or if they decide not to stream, you don't have a reason to watch anymore, right? So that's another facet of like the official broadcast can, and I know sometimes infuriatingly so, through their connections with players, end up doing content like pros, right? Um, or like something a little bit goofier, like Are You Smarter Than? Um, and the value that co-streamers have, again, is I think they can bring in a lot of their friends who used to be pros, or used to be coaches, or are current coaches, or are current pros. So um it's frustrating to me that in the rise of co-streamers, I guess there are in my opinion, and again, you can say I'm definitely biased because I'm on an official broadcast, right? But I think there are things that an official broadcast can bring that co-streaming can't, just like there are things that co-streaming can bring that the official broadcast can't. And I'd like them to be recognized equally.
Yeah, I think that's true, but there's also a lot of organic content that you can have by just like pulling players on after. Like I know the LS co-stream always gets access to FlyQuest players afterward, and you can do even longer interviews there. So that's like very specifically catered towards fans of that specific team, right? So that's where you can have like co-streams as kind of like more in-depth kind of cheerleaders for specific teams. The Medic rant specifically was more about how, like, looking at the LEC final, for example, Cage Roll's viewership was higher than the main broadcast, right? That's the first time that's effectively happened. And so then the broadcasters say, look, this is actually giving us a return for basically no spend, right? Effectively no spend. How is it possible that, like, why would we invest money into a main broadcast for like paying staff, paying producers, paying like for an entire set and like all the bells and whistles when we could just like have a co-streamer broadcast the games as jankily as possible and get arguably a larger return, right? That's like kind of the logic behind it, which you then have a whole nuanced discussion about, okay, but all the production value that the co-streamer is using, because there's a big difference in the viewership you get from live viewing versus co-streaming or whatever, is also inherent in that stream. So how can you separate the value of that from the co-stream itself, right? Like you get Cajal reacting to the players being interviewed on the broadcast. You get players Cajal reacting to like things that the analysts or the casters say. Things like that is very different. Like for example, I have this in the agenda for later on, but I think it probably works better to talk about here. Like in the past, historically, we had LPL not have, like, there were rumors that LPL was just going to give English broadcasting rights to co-streamers and effectively dissolve the English broadcast, and that would fall under the category of the Bayan kind of Portuguese LCS co-stream, right? That would be the situation there, and then you wouldn't have an English LPL broadcast. The co-streamers allegedly came out in defense of the English broadcast, and that ended up not happening. Except there was a compromise where now some games are not broadcasted, some games are. And then, of course, now Collegiate League of Legends, which I don't know if you're familiar with what's been going on there. The Collegiate League of Legends, initially the partner GG Tech that Riot gave like the broadcasting and the tournament organization rights to, has decided that they will not have an official broadcast. They will just have a co-streaming partnership program. So that's one of those things that's like kind of the fallout of the success of co-streamers is like the difference in, okay, what is the broadcast, and then the extra layer to that is that casters within the community have now started a GoFundMe to broadcast
Yeah, I saw that.
the tournament, and they've hit enough goals to broadcast top 8. Their goal for a full round of 32 would be 13,500, and that's again money that Riot and GG Tech do not have to spend to put on this broadcast because they have a community basically willing to crowdsource it and do it for them. So again, that adds like another layer, which then reinforces the idea that for a broadcast you don't even have to spend money. So it's one of those like that the community will maybe fund it for you. Like that becomes like the conversation at that point. So I guess like that's a lot. I don't know if you have any reactions to any of those events or any ideas on your side.
I mean, I think the big thing is that it follows a trend of like money put into the broadcast of tier 2 and amateur overall, in at least in LCS over the past few years, which is they've just been like pulling back and pulling back. And I've already on here and elsewhere, and I know you have also talked about the impact that that has had on just general talent development. But I think the big thing with that, if you look at official broadcasts within their own region, because there's still a difference in terms of the LPL English broadcast and the Chinese LPL broadcast. Just like there's a difference between the the LCK English broadcast and the LCK Korean broadcast, where you run into a particular weirdness with like uh major region broadcasts in their own language, which is what we'd be, or I guess in their own language, because LEC is really odd because the English language broadcast is the primary broadcast, but you do have a whole bunch of other companies that are broadcasting it, and a bunch of other co-streamers are broadcasting it in a variety of languages. But like you would then run into concerns of like, and you and I have talked about revenue for major regions, right? And how the vast majority of revenue for any major esports league is always partnerships. And whether that's good or bad, we've argued with that about that. But the big thing that becomes tricky to do in terms of having a co-streamer just be the main essential broadcast of a league is that you then run into like if it were to happen, and again this would not be applicable to like LPLEN, but weirdly would be maybe slightly more applicable to collegiate not having a broadcast, because you could theoretically sell that to partners and like get schools involved in the broadcast itself. And I know for something like LEC, you want teams to be able to make money, right? Like that is the whole big thing. Is Riot took a step back and is like, we do not see esports as solely a marketing arm for the game. We see it as something that needs to be independently profitable within their own leagues. And if you've listened to anything I said, you already know I personally disagreed with that. Whatever. It's they're not going to change, so it's fine. Not anything I haven't said publicly. Not anything I haven't talked about internally. But then you run into the problem of like, okay, if you're only doing co-streams, then how do your teams make money? Right? Because like part of the major revenue force right now, even if you're not breaking even, is selling partnerships to the main broadcast. So that's something that is like, I mean, in one way, kind of fascinating for me to watch. In another way, like it is a very and I know like this has been talked elsewhere on multiple streams, but like it is a very terrifying time to be a broadcaster. I'll say that.
Yeah, I think it is very difficult because you are in a position now where in theory like the broadcast rights get sold, but you can also make the argument like I'm going to sell my broadcast right, I'm going to sell the sponsorship to this specific team, right? And then I'm going to sell the sponsorship to this specific co-streamer, right? And then the co-streamer becomes independently well off. You're skipping like the middleman with the tournament organizers and the broadcasters, and you're still paying for the teams, right? So that would be the counter argument that you could make. I think the biggest problem is like at the end of the day, it is an entertainment platform, like an entertainment industry, and you do have to, in some way, have like a central broadcast where you watch the teams play and compete to give a sense of like competitive energy. Like that is the product, right? So the question then becomes like, who owns it? Who's it better to own? And I think a big part of it is just at the end of the day, if this is Riot's opinion on the broadcast, right, or on esports, then they should have never owned it, right? They should have continued to outsource the competition to other tournament organizers, to have had like more of a Wild West kind of vibe. Again, that would be less stable for the teams and players, right? The teams and players wouldn't necessarily be receiving consistent salary. You'd have something more similar to like a Dota model. But you would have, I guess, like an ownership arm that's solely focused on the profitability of the broadcast product or the profitability of the sports, and then you would have Riot, who only have to care about their skin sales, etc. Right? So it's it's a different, and this is why like we've kind of tracked also the COD League, news, which we'll probably talk about it in a future episode, because that's huge. I think like the implications for that are quite large. Because we talked about the lawsuit in the beginning from like Optic. So we'll probably come back when it's not MSI and do something like that. But for now, I think that's like at the end of the day, this is weird because it's like Riot fought so hard to have this thing, and now they're basically saying no, we actually don't want this thing. But they also kind of don't want anyone else to have it either, in a weird way. So it is very one of those like, do you cut the baby in half, or would their true mother give the baby away? You know, so.
Oh my gosh, we got some biblical references up in here. Nice.
We're doing well. All right.
Wow.
I think so we talked a lot about that one, but we kind of combined two topics in one. Let's talk a little bit about roster news. There've been a few, and then there's one also that came out since I made this list. But the big kind of rumor that's bubbling is that Heretics would be recreating 100 Thieves topside on their LEC team. That's like the one rumor that has been bubbling up. The veracity of that rumor is dubious at best. However, it is just a fun little experiment to talk about. Oh yeah, sorry. I always mix up I don't know why I always call KC Heretics. But K Corp.
Wait, I was like,
K-Corp.
wait, isn't it
Not
Carmine
Heretics,
Corp?
it's K Corp. I have no
Yeah,
idea. I
okay.
cannot for the life of me stop calling K Corp Heretics, which one is Spanish, one is French. They have absolutely nothing in relation to each other except that one came up after the other one. But I always get those two names mixed up for absolutely zero fucking reason. It's just a normal thing. Anyway, so that's the idea is that they would have like someday closer Abadage, because like Abadage has been engaging with all the rumors. People are saying, you know, like it must be someday, and it feels like it's a purely speculative like kind of conversation at this point, but it's like gaining momentum with fans, and when things gain momentum with fans, they actually have a higher chance of happening than when they don't gain momentum.
Sad but true.
So yeah, we are talking about NA Squid because these are all NA players, right?
NA players, yeah.
Abadage, closer, and Sunday.
Oh god. All right. Well, I mean, you've worked with some of these players. Like, why? I have to ask you the question of why you would want to recreate the 100 Thieves topside.
Mostly for brand. Mostly for like the idea of gathering something in a bottle that was successful in another region and gaining that kind of engagement. Like closer is obviously confirmed, right? That was a rumor that we didn't discuss last episode because it hadn't quite like come out yet, but closer is confirmed.
I think it came out the same day as we recorded or something like that.
Yeah, it came out like almost immediately after. It came out before the VOD came out,
yeah.
At least. Like so then we ended up having the Abadage engaging with the content, and he was like kind of trying to stir shit up a bit. It's not like quite likely that he'll be going. And then the someday rumor kind of just like came with it as a package deal because people don't like Cabochard for various reasons. And I think it's just like kind of crazy that people are like suddenly latching on to this idea for almost nostalgia value. I think it's like very likely not going to happen, right? At this point, I think like Casey has even denied it, but I think it's very funny. Like it's just like definitely a zeitgeist of what fans like, how like fan rumors snowball, and like things that fans get excited about, which is just, oh hey, I know those players, that would be cool. So that's also ends up being how a lot of rosters get made, which is, oh, I know those players, that would be cool. So yeah, a fun time.
So in the fact that like closer is confirmed, how well do you think because obviously, like, I think a lot of people looked at this KC roster and they were like, obviously, this roster seems to have a lot of issues in terms of coordination. And I know one of the big things that people were pointing out is like whether you were on the Bo, whether you like remained on the Bo hype train or you thought he was just like the absolute worst player on the team. The
You
big
have
thing
to
was
pick
that
one.
you have to pick one. You can't be in the middle, obviously.
You can't have a nuanced opinion. Anyway.
But I think, like it within that range, regardless of where you fell, Bo was always trying to make plays, and the team, depending on how you perceived it, either wasn't following them or he was going without the team and just not listening to the rest of it. And what do you think Closer would bring to this team? Because for a while, and like I was kind of a Closer defender to some extent, not as big as Raz. I think not he as in Closer, not Raz. Had a really down last split in LCS. So I'm not really sure where he would end up because obviously knowing what he's capable of and knowing that that was definitely not what he showcased in his last split in LCS. I'm just wondering where he'd even fit or like what we think he could bring to a team.
So everyone like working with the team who I kind of like politely asked about it and who were not willing to wax philosophical and go more in depth, politely would say things like double lift and Closer should not work together. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they had like insane beef. I think it more means that their ideas about the game were not similar. And Closer is much more like, if you know Closer, he's much more the type that wants to go for plays and make plays specifically around bot lane. Like he will give up sack his entire top side to make like some bot lane play, which is why he worked well with FBI because FBI loves it when his jungler gives up his entire top side to cake bot. I think the thing is that like Upset as a player sees himself as that kind of player who wants his jungler to give up everything to gank bot, but he is way more of the double lift type who will kind of scale with his lead and not necessarily go for the big plays or go for the big skirmishes. So I feel like in practice you're going to have what looks like the jungler Upset wants, but Upset does not actually know what he wants. And so therefore you're going to end up in a very similar situation is my guess. I will say one take I've seen is that it's weird that if you have like Closer Abadage, someday you'll have no shot caller. It's like Closer was almost always the leader of 100 Thieves with Huki, right? So
that's kind of weird to hear because he is like really, really talkative in game.
But
like,
that's like one weird take I've seen fans make, which is like again like a weird fan take because fans just talk about random shit without knowing anything. So I think that's they do all the time. It's true.
Kelsey versus fans.
Kelsey versus fans. I mean, GMs talk about shit all the time without knowing anything too. I mean, that's how misconceptions about players start, right? Is like someone makes a comment and that just becomes the factual thing. But that's why I bring it up because Closer does talk a lot. He is considered a leader. So there is a chance that like if things are not working, Closer is going to be someone who tries to change things, right? Or who tries to push back. So there is that chance. But to me, I don't see this as a pickup that drastically changes how Casey play in almost any tangible way. I think if anything, like if Closer played more on top, that would be something different because I think KC do look better when they play towards top side. And that's, I mean, that doesn't cover for all their other problems, but that is.
But it's a start. Yeah, I was just wondering what your opinion was.
Yeah. So there were a couple other ones. The other one was Licorice to Dignitas is a big rumor, which I know some people are very excited about that. I think it's kind of whatever. Like a lot of top lane changes this offseason. A lot of top lane changes when unless your top laner is legit like griefing going 0-10, top lane changes tend to not significantly impact the team standings. But
Yeah.
any thoughts on Licorice to Dig?
I mean, if they keep the same rest of the roster, so like I know the big difference that could happen with Licorice on this team is the fact that obviously XU was really open about how he did have a lot of difficulty communicating with his top side, so both Dove and Rich. And they developed into a really bot lane focused team, which I actually don't disagree with given how well Tomo and Isles were playing. Um, like I think that they really surprised me personally with how good they were from just absolutely grinding games when Champs Queue was open to spamming solo queue to, really becoming the focal point of a lot of the way that Dig played and actually delivering on that. So that was really cool to see. But I do think that obviously you would want, even if you're not going to be like perma ganking for topside, I think you'd want to be able to communicate with that side of the map. So that would, I think, I agree with you in terms of I'm not sure how much it would change for the team in terms of like performance um, in top with Licorice coming in for Rich. But I also think that at the very least, XU as a jungler would be able, provided that they, keep him, um, would be able to communicate with Licorice a lot better, right? So you just might see a lot more team cohesion across the board.
As we were talking about this, not so many has reported that Vladdy will be going to KC as starting mid laner,
Aha!
which is very
Rip.
interesting because I mean I didn't think Abadege was actually going to go to the LAC roster, but it's very interesting because I just watched Vladdy play against GK, and obviously this is not necessarily an indictment of his entire career, but he did not look considerably good relative to the mid laner he was facing. But that's fine, This is where Empire in chat gets his Gyu appreciation segment. So there you go. Go Gyu. Speaking of NA players, we have. So Vladdy is getting promoted, which again, like I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that move either. I think it might create like more energy in the team, but for me it's like not necessarily a player that everyone was looking for massive changes on. My biggest issue with all the K Corp roster changes is like it's not like NA changes. We talked about this before, where it's you still have a shit ton of money left on your balance sheets because you still have to pay those other players, right? You still have to pay them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not getting terminated and then off your balance sheet. So you're just spending a ridiculous amount of money to not make worlds, most likely. We talked about the likelihood that they would make worlds. It's very low. And then probably redo your roster again at the end of the year. So I'm very curious, like, what their reasoning is. I would love to hear from K-Corp management. They're making all these changes, like, what the thought is. If it's just, like, everyone's completely mental boomed, so they have to make, like, a bunch of changes.
Mm.
Or the mental of the players will not survive, but I doubt like a GM will have that thought in mind. So, or I guess an ownership group will justify a lot of spend for the sake of that. So we'll see what ends up happening from there. Any thoughts for you?
I mean, I'm not familiar with him, so I can't really comment. I see Empire being like Vladdy is good.
Yeah, he didn't have like a bad
uh,
series. We'll put it that way, but
but
he did get outperformed.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I think I mean, we'll see. They looked kind of better at the beginning of this past split and then didn't. So I don't know, to your point, like I know obviously at the end of the split they came out and said we need to make changes because this performance is unacceptable. And so we'll see if it works out for them, but it is going to be a really, really tough road ahead. Like it would be an incredible miracle run if this team ended up, just because of the way that championship points work for LEC, like, what do they call it now? Their grand finals, or like their regional finals, or whatever their final tournament is at the end of the year. And then they're also, as Empire said, kind of sort of in the Khalees waiting room, I think, still. So that'll be something to maybe look forward to for next year.
Yeah, again, I don't know like how drastically Khalees will change anything other than the fact that you don't have the upset bad blood, but we'll see. We'll see. It's a very interesting team because it feels like you're changing absolutely everything, and I'm not quite sure how it will come together, but especially if like bot is the same and you have a jungler who camps bot still, I'm very curious to see if that will continue to be the case. I'll see if they make changes there. The other element of it that I think is there was another announcement, one more, because we kind of skipped over the licorice thing. I think we both kind of said it's okay. I think the one take on that I saw was that like licorice will be the veteran figure, and I feel like that is very unlikely to happen because we had our FlyQuest roster where he was supposed to be the veteran figure, and he was not really that. He's like kind of a lot more reserved, I would say, like individually. I don't know, maybe he has developed those skills because I do think you can develop leadership over time. So it would be cool to see him like kind of evaluate and try again. But I don't know if that's why you hire him, right? So I don't think that was like why the decision was made. I would assume it was because they felt Rich was underperforming towards the end of the splits. Licorice would create like a better holistic language environment and give them more options to play around. So I assume that that's like more why they went with him. If he does step up as a leader, then happy for him. Excited to see what they can do, because I think Dig had like a lot of people will say like I hated watching Dig the most, but I actually thought they were very interesting. A lot of people will say like I liked watching IMT more than Dig. Dig were so boring, but I actually thought they were pretty fun because they played for hard 2v2 and they had some really cool moments. So hope that they do a good job and they have a good split in summer. All right, so that was it. So we're going to have a short interlude, okay? You have to watch the stream for this. I'm gonna need your reaction. Okay. So there's a very important fashion trend that has been taking the LPL by storm. Okay.
It's here huge. It comes.
And I actually really like it. You know, I've been affected by it. So what I'm going to need from you, Emily Rand, is to help me pick out the Bolo that looks best on me. Okay? So
no.
I have a selection of Bolos.
Wait, are you serious? Oh my god.
That I need your opinion on. All right, this is very important content. Okay, so
yeah, for people that are unaware, if you have not watched the LPL broadcast, they're all in bolo ties, like all of them. I am not a bolo tie aficionado.
So I'm showing the screenshot from the grand final on screen. All of the men on broadcast wore the bolo ties. It was spectacular. So I'm having Emily pick out one that, I don't know, complements my outfit or my eyes. I don't know, whatever direction you want to go with it. I don't care. Anyway, we have the nice, like, onyx, beautiful black.
That's a pretty big one, actually.
They're all, like, gonna be relatively big, but
okay.
It's mostly
I was gonna say, because a lot of the LPL casters were, like, really small.
They have, like, less, I mean, I have to make a statement, okay? Like, I need something that distracts from the other large objects on my chest. So, we've got
dying.
We've got this one. I forget. I think is it this technically a topaz? I don't know. It's brown and striped. So there.
It looks like a tiger's eye almost.
Yeah, tiger's eye. That's
I like that one.
That's what it was called in the rock stores. you're a kid and you go to the rock stores
store.
and you're like,
Yeah.
can I buy rocks? And then your parents are like, no, why would we buy rocks? We literally have rocks in the fucking porch. Anyway.
This sounds like personal anecdote.
This one, we've got a little bit of engraving going on. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, it's like a turquoise one?
Yeah, it's like a turquoise. It's got some marbling going on. Very nice.
Nice. Where did you get all of these?
Amazon. Anyway, they're authentic and very expensive, as you can tell. And then the last one is lack of marbling on this and round, so very similar to the other ones, but it has like a very intricate design. I don't know, on the fringes.
Hold it up to the camera.
Yeah, so you can see the intricate design on the fringes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm gonna need your opinion on which one.
I think I like the tiger's eye one the best, actually.
Okay. All right. So we'll be wearing the tiger's eye for most content going forward. As I try on my look, and this now has Emily's fashion brand of approval. Don't ask questions. That's how it is. All right.
Matt Scoot agrees, so it's fine. Yeah. I have one chatter who agrees with me.
Nice.
But no, I actually think that one's the coolest.
The winner. Okay. We got the tiger's eye Bolo sorted. Fashion corner. That was. It
looks amazing with the checkered shirt.
Yeah. I'm gonna need the cam to prominently. So I'm gonna cut off the top of my head so we can prominently feature the Bolo tie for the rest of the episode. Anyway. Next.
Amazing. So this is what people come to this for instead of the Making the Rounds Doctor podcast.
This is what sets us apart. We may not have very expensive 10-year residency programs or whatever, but we have Bolo ties. So, very important. Anyway, so this is probably what you came here for. We're gonna take that interlude and translate into MSI. And if there's one thing that the show may have a reputation for right now, it's caring about minor regions or developing regions, and watching a lot of those tape. I've been doing the VOD reviews, like 3 to 4 hour VOD reviews on stream, but also watching more VODs on the side to kind of talk about and like give a decent image of my thoughts on the teams. But instead of talking strictly about the matchups first, we would like to mostly just like tell you about which players on which teams you should be looking out for, who are like super fun to watch, that have good storylines or anything like that, because this is like a big platform for them to kind of show off. So would love to start from there. So the first team I have on the docket is Estral Esports.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think so going through this is going to be like less about playstyle, but I think the big thing is that Estral had tried to kind of win with basically importing a lot of players and investing money into players like Sam D. B-Boy was on this team, Boogie was on this team, and they decided to essentially go with an all Latin American roster this year, which is also reliant on kind of pre-existing synergy with Cody and Ackerman from their time together on Infinity. And I think it has worked out really, really well for this team overall. I think they've been able to gain a lot of fans that way. I also think the position of Jose Deodo as the kind of captain of this team, and then Cody's performances. I think if you're watching and you really want to see like the heart of this team, that's definitely where I'd start. We talked about Cody briefly when we were going through group draw.
Yep.
Because he had been looked at by a few NA orgs and he's been on the NA server. But then also, I think in talking to people from LLA and kind of coordinating with other people who have talked to a bunch of LLA journalists and kind of coaches and players, they basically say that, like, you know, Jose Deodo is him in terms of, like, he is the player that really, really represents this region, not only because of his personality, which, like, that's kind of what caught people's attention before. And obviously, he was on FlyQuest, but also as Latin American fans, having a player that could go to LCS, perform pretty well, still be someone who people like was a standout in terms of people were paying attention to him and how he played. He's like really, really beloved by the community. The other thing I thought was really, really interesting was obviously they're going up against T1 in their first matchup, and that's going to be incredibly one-sided, in my opinion. But I think it was really interesting to hear from the players themselves who said that, like, they are really happy to face T1 because it will be like a very interesting test for them. Not going into it obviously being like, oh man, you know, we're gonna take down one of the best teams, but like as a measurement of like how well they've improved as a team across the split, especially with some of their games, like I think it was in the upper bracket was the reverse sweep against R7. I think. But anyway, yeah, like I think they're looking at the T1 matchup, it seems anyway, as a measurement of like how well they've been able to improve and develop as a team together, which I think is a really good and holistic way of kind of approaching taking on a team that is, you know, one of the best teams in the world, probably.
Yeah, I think the other element of it is like I watched a lot of their VODs. I think the exciting thing is like there's a lot of excitement for fans of this being like an all LATAM team. Going to MSI, I think a lot of fans are like super excited about that. Um, and then the other element for it is like these are all players who have been around. Like the storyline, I remember when Jose Deodo got picked up for LCS, like there was still like duo queue kind of allowed. And Cody was like often his duo partner. And they were both like really high on the ladder, but the general consensus was Jose Deodo was the better player, right? That was the general consensus. But now when I watch, like, obviously Jose Deodo is a big, and then I've had like fans tell me that in the last week before playoffs he was sick. So like when I watched that series, they're saying like there was less direction, etc. I think they played kind of similar to how they were playing earlier, but Jose Deodo being like a big captain is very definitely like a huge part of the narrative. But I think Cody, for me, like generally has the most pressure. Like when they've struggled a bit more, like versus like K9, I think Seiya was able to keep good pressure. I think Cody is like more of the, I guess, old school Chovy type mid in the sense that like he's almost consistently doing well in his lane, but he's not extending his pressure to side lanes as much. So you'll be able to see. I think it'll be very interesting to see that style play out because I think T1 will show up a lot of the gaps in like their early game coordination from that perspective because a lot of times they are just getting massive leads in the 2v2s, in the 1v1s, and playing like that. And then like they get into mid game and Cody constantly being able to push out a side lane and no one responds to it is a big factor of it, but they don't transition that pressure from side lane and mid game to the rest of the map, so their games end up being very, very long. Very, very long. But I do think they're super fun, like from an individual skill level to watch, which is hard to say. Like I don't think I've ever said about like a team coming out of LLA. Like there are very talented players on this team. I think Snaker is someone I was impressed by. I haven't seen like a lot from him before, but like I think he stepped up since the last time I watched him. I think Cody is like performing really, really well. Obviously, everyone points out Jose Deodo. So I think that these are like all. And then Ackerman actually had a lot of moments playing around Vision where I was like, oh, he's actually like really thinking about this. Like he's walking through line brush. So if I had to pick one player though, I don't want to be like too support biased, but I don't have like a lot of supports actually on this list, so I would actually pick Ackerman. I think Ackerman is like if you like watching like the little nuances of like he's putting this ward here or he's walking around this ward, like Ackerman's kind of fun to watch. But you have to be like a big nerd. He's not gonna be flashy, but it's like you have to be like a mini map nerd, I think, to appreciate Ackerman. But from that perspective, I really do like him, and I had a lot of fun watching his games.
Be boring and just say, because obviously I talked about Jose Deodo a lot. I think people are going to be watching for him for a variety of reasons. That was just going to be boring and say Cody, because I do think he is really good, and obviously like I think it's a lot of people's dream to go up against Faker and like see how well you do. And that'll be the position that Cody will be going into this matchup. And I like in a weird way, like obviously Faker can seem kind of like this insurmountable player to go up against, right? And T1 an insurmountable team, but I think that that has to be like a fun position to be in, right? Again, and everything coming out of this team has said like we want to use this as a springboard to see like how well we have improved as a team. And so yeah, I think Cody is a player that you should be watching out for. Also, a random aside before we move on is that there is a chance that they end up going up against FlyQuest on this side of the bracket, depending, where Jose Deodo would go up against his former org, which is kind of a cool, like, small storyline.
His former org, yeah. Like, I think that's, like, a very fun one, because he did get replaced. I think also FlyQuest, they have a very similar reputation, where their jungler is, like, the shot caller, the leader. He like micromanage his bot lane on which wave they can play aggressively on, like to that level. And if you have heard inspired comms, which I have, he is to that level actually. Like I don't think I've ever heard a shot caller to inspired's level before in my entire life, and there are good and bad things about that. But like in League, I think it's a very nuanced, complicated game where if you're constantly micromanaging your teammates, they have so many things that they have to think about for themselves, so it becomes a lot harder. But he does a very good job as a leader. Like he is a very straightforward leader. He's a very strong leader, and Jose Deodo has that reputation in LATAM. So I think that's like a very fun kind of rival leader storyline that you can play on. Do I think that they would take a game in that scenario? I think it really depends, right? Like, there's maybe a chance where they're like pressuring lanes like really, really hard, and FlyQuest don't necessarily play super to that. But overall, I would expect FlyQuest to take the series in general. So yeah. Yes. All right. So let's do loud.
Ooh.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Emily used to be the CB LOL girl, and she's lost that reputation over the years.
I mean, as deserved, because I have not had time to watch. But I think the big thing with this loud team is that they're now approaching kind of a Brazilian dynasty at this point, where they have won 4 titles back to back to back to back. Their top laner, Robo, also became the winningest player in CBLOL history with 7 titles now. So obviously, if you've seen international competition and you've seen Loud at all, you probably are familiar with it. At the very least, the top side of this roster, which is Robo, Croc, and Tinones, who is still playing. And if you're familiar with his name, you might just remember him from the Kaboom Alliance team. But obviously, he's just become such a CBLOL like staple player because he has been playing since season 3 in like Riot Brazil major tournaments. I think the big thing with this Loud team, as opposed to their previous like appearances, is last year, especially at MSI, I remember people being like, "Oh, this team actually has a better understanding than we expected of like side wave pressure, especially with their solo laners in Robo or Tin sending them to side lanes." And apparently, a lot of that came from Seus, and Seus left the team. There was like a little bit of drama involved, I think. I don't know the extent of it, so I'm not going to go over it. But essentially, he returned to Kaboom, and they brought in Redbert, which was a really unpopular signing, only because people were kind of saying that he is a little bit washed. He's also been playing for a really long time. But with this title, he became the first Brazilian support to win 4 titles of 4 different ADCs. I still think that overall, this is, even with 4 of the 5 same players that we saw last year, this team, in missing some of Seus's shot calling, is not as strong in the same things that they were previously. And talking to a bunch of people in the Brazilian scene about them, they basically did say that in Brazil, this is the best team when it comes to like macro and being able to trade objectives on the map and also still having side wave control. But the problem is if they either don't have winning solo laners for Croc to either play around or use to invade. Sometimes he can get caught out and they'll make mistakes because they still play aggressively anyway. And also, they pointed out that Croc and Tinones don't necessarily always have really good mid jungle synergy. So sometimes they don't necessarily fight for river vision when they should. And then obviously bot lane, because a lot of, I think, this team's map movements did come from Seus, and some of those decisions that they did make last year a little bit lessened this year. That's kind of the overall sentiment, and I would generally agree with that. I do think their bot lane is a bit worse going into this year, and then I also think, like a lot of teams coming up, they will get punished for some of their overreaches when they aren't able to get down river vision to like cover for their side lanes. But yeah, I mean, I think trying to think, the player I would say to watch out for would probably be Robo. I think he's just a really fun player. He, going into this, has pretty much spammed Jax, but also picked up stuff like the Rek'Sai top, which we probably won't see at MSI due to patch changes. But I think he's willing to play a variety of different things. And if you've ever seen him previously, you probably know him as the guy that slammed Darius top lane, is really willing to play a lot of very, very aggressive picks and then side lane with them. And he's just a very fun like personality to kind of follow. And I also think if this team is going to have any success at MSI, it really will come through being able to play around their solo lanes. And if they're able to do that, then they might have a chance to take a few games. I think overall their macro has decreased from last year.
The thing that's very interesting to me about Loud is I started out in my VOD review with you on Robo thinking, oh, like he's actually doing a good job in this game against Kaboom of like making sure he gets the wave inside so they can make like a hard trade on the other side so they can play the map like this. Like actually Robo's like playing really well. all of this stuff. But then like as the games went on, I was like, huh. So as
Yeah.
we saw more and more, like I think especially his play in team fights was like a little bit more lackluster. For me, I think like Tenodes is my shout out for this team. I think Tenodes has like a very good story. I might link the article I read in like 2022, where I mean he's had like a very low points in his career, and now he's like consistently at the top, like consistently here. There's like a lot of jokes about like him being a very strong player. Like him and Robo have had very nuanced storied careers, and so it's like great to kind of play off of those players. I think Tinones was someone who um, did very well on like the Talia's jumps like this and was creating a lot of pressure for the team, even when they didn't. His better picks were definitely like the control mages, which is why I thought their team fights kind of stood out more than their macro to an extent, and I attribute a lot of that to Tinones. So that's like for me the where I looked the most. There were definitely like a lot of creative ganks invades from Croco Croc. Uh, so there are definitely a lot of creative invades from him. I liked those. Like I liked how they used Bob Pressure. Uh, I thought their team play was like better early, in contrast
Mhm.
with Estral, who I thought like their solo laners put better pressure in mid game, and so it's like an interesting contrast where it's like you have better team play, maybe slightly worse laning, but your team fights I think were like a little bit let down by some of the frontline play. But I still think like this team is like super fun, and I would say like watch Chinones. I will try to find the article I read. It's in Portuguese, but you can Google Translate because that's how we do things these days. Um, and
There's
it's
also, have you heard the joke about fans calling Tin and Robo LEC
yeah,
players?
because there was the rumor
Yeah.
that they were supposed to go LEC, but I don't
Yeah.
know the veracity of that one at all. But
Yeah.
it
I
is a
don't
fun
think
one.
it's the community has just picked it up as like a joke where they call them LEC players.
Yeah, so I did know this one, which is that Abadaga is actually going to replace Vladdy uh, on KCB Blue or KCB, so he'll be on their academy team.
Oh, so
Yeah.
he'll be waiting in the wings.
Yes. So he is
Interesting.
actually doing that. That was like
The
that was
blue
why
square
he was
tweet.
like doing the misdirection and talking about like the K Corp because he is
That's great.
actually going to K Corp. He's just not going to the LEC roster. So yeah, good times. Shout out to the earlier conversation we had there. Um, yeah. So that's loud and in interest of time, we will talk about GAM next. And you know, did you actually VOD
Uh,
review this team? I need to know.
I watched the finals.
Because I actually did.
It was a tough time. I think this is the worst. And like again, through no fault of their own, I think
Mm-hmm.
they're the worst team here. The finals were interesting though because we had the SOFM support, which was also very
Yeah. Oh,
interesting.
I love the
Uh,
Hui. Yeah, it was great.
yeah.
No, you could
um,
tell that Gam had no idea how to fucking deal with Hui support because he was
yeah,
like spamming that shit in the upper bracket as well. So there you go.
that was his in, you know. But obviously, no. Like jokes aside, it really sucks what happened in
Mm,
BCS. We've covered it several times. I think this GAM team, if you're looking at two players, obviously, like I still think it meant so much to like if you look at their reactions after
yeah.
winning, they're really emotional. Like it meant a lot to these
Yeah, I mean,
players
this has
to
to
be able
be.
like that's such a tough situation and so
Yeah.
like I it obviously like really meant a lot to them. um Obviously I think the player everyone is probably going to be looking at is Levi.
Hmm.
I think the player you should watch is Kiaya. um
Yeah.
I think Kiaya is really good actually. I think he's even been able to give like some of the best tops some trouble in lane. Um, and I think if you're looking at a window for this team to do anything, it would be through maybe some pressure that Kiaya is able to create on top side. But yeah, it's it's pretty tough, and it's through no fault of the players on this roster.
Yeah, I almost feel bad because it felt like no matter what happened in the game, in the games, like every game I watched of GAM, like I watched pre-playoffs games where they had their old roster. I watched their playoffs games. I watched. No one should have to watch that many GAM playoffs games, but I did watch them, and it especially feels weird because you know that they're actually going to have considerably more time together in the
Mhm.
boot camp leading up to MSI. So they're actually going to have like some semblance of style and team play by the time they get to MSI. They just clearly did not have it
Yeah, they just I mean, they
in
didn't have enough
playoffs.
time together.
So it almost is a waste of time to do it. But I did want to get like a feel for the individual players. So that's why I watched it and kind of like how they're playing in this situation. It just felt like no matter what, Kiaya always wins top. Like
Yep.
nothing will stop him. He will always win the top lane. They will always have that pressure, so they could do whatever else they want on the map. And in the games in the final where they did look good was when like bot lane didn't explode in the first 3 minutes. And you were actually
We cross
able
our fingers.
to play around top, and that's like when they looked the best because obviously like Levi, Kiaya have the built-in synergy, are two very individually strong players in the context of the VCS. Um, so I think that those are definitely there. I loved watching Emo get better. Like over the course of playoffs, Emo's trajectory is just
Just
like
rooting for him.
so enjoyable. So I think like when I had my GAM takeaways, my like the last one was I love Emo and I hope he succeeds because it's kind of that's kind of where I am. Because it started out where he was like giving prio in like the Tristana lane, just completely lost. Died multiple times, and then they got 2-0 in their first series, and then by the end, like he felt like a legitimate threat in playoffs, and I think that's great. Like that he was able to kind of improve and have his glow up so quickly. Um, so I am excited to see what Emo does at MSI. So he will be my pick because I assumed you would pick Levi,
Kiaya. Oh,
but
I mean, yeah, I
yeah,
picked Kiaya.
uh,
I also think like for like we've
I'm glad you
tried to
picked
tell
Kiaya
it.
though. Yeah,
Yeah, like I actually, I mean, I think he's legitimately a good top laner. I also think his story for people that don't know is really, really interesting. And I'll try to find the link to the documentary. It's in Vietnamese, but basically,
yeah,
for the short of it, he essentially dropped out of school like during elementary school. Um, his family was like really, really poor, and he learned um Vietnamese like through playing League of Legends. And when he was picked up by GAM, they were really like upfront about like, oh, we have to teach this person like life skills as well. But it's a really cool documentary
yeah.
and a very cool story. Um, and yeah, like that's in tandem with the fact that I just actually think that he's a good top laner. I also think like if you see any sort of like I fully expect Fnatic to completely wipe GAM. However, if there is any sort of in for GAM at all, it is going to be through topside and the Kiaya Oscar matchup.
I think they should lane swap.
You do?
I think Fnatic reacted really poorly to lane swaps when G2 did them. VCS actually, as a region, have a history of lane
True.
swaps.
True.
And they've done lane swaps. Like I always tell the anecdote about how the coach of GAM in like 2017 said, "Kelsey, my players can't make it like above a certain threshold in KR solo queue. They're not individually strong enough to play standard versus this team. We have to do stuff like lane swaps." So I just think like whatever advantage you maybe could get out of top lane, like bot lane is in such a position where
Is gonna get yeah.
Like, I
Yeah,
don't
makes
think that
sense.
that's fixable in the time they have to prep for MSI. Maybe
Yeah,
they could prove me wrong, but a lot of it is just like very fundamental misplays, like very fundamental issues where it's like you almost have to reteach them how to think about laning in order to get something out of them, which is why it'll be even funnier if Fnatic lose. So,
but
no, I'm rooting for Gam
I
just
don't
for
think
the
they'll
the
drop a
memes.
game. I don't think they'll lose a game to Gam, but
I'm
we'll
rooting
see.
for Gam just for the memes of like if they do win a game, it's like, oh my god, you guys just lost to a pug team. Like,
God.
it's too-
So you're just
no,
rooting for
but
maximum chaos. Got it.
yes, but I also really like imagine because like Levi, Kiaya, they've done very well in VCS for many years, but
Yeah.
imagine the stress and the frustrations of this season and like
Yeah.
coming second with their main roster, and having two players banned and the entire league just going dark for so long, having to put together a team at the very last second, do like 2-3 days of scrims, run your playoffs with like only 1 day off in the playoffs to break as like a possible scrim or break day, and then run all the way through, make it through. It has to be like almost more cathartic than most of the wins you've had. Like it has to, like you
Yeah.
made the comment about the how relieved or
Yeah,
how
you
they
can see
looked
it. They're
like.
like full on crying.
Yeah,
Like
like
it was obviously something that meant so much.
it has to like, oh my gosh, they have hustled for this shit so hard, like that's so stressful. So absolutely will root for Gam, like for sure. I think like a lot of people will root for Gam. No, like with the context and the backdrop. So
Yeah.
I do hope they do well. But I very low expectations based on how they were
Yeah.
performing. We'll see. Like I said, they have like 2 weeks to come up with a cool strat and like really drill it and try to make some surprise games. And I think maybe they can do like an upset that I like. For the love of God, Gam, please lane swap. Like just that's, that's your best shot. I think Fnatic's reaction to lane swaps is bad. They will have time to fix that as well, but it seems like conceptually, based on the public statements they've made about lane swaps, their idea of how to lane swap is just fundamentally flawed. So take advantage of that, Gam, and try to win a game.
Become the
Uh,
unknown.
become the true trespasser.
We've
Become the
talked
unknown.
about how much we hate this tagline on the
All
LP
right,
Loco stream. Anyway,
one more team to talk about because we've talked about all the other teams in other
oh god, that
episodes.
made everything shake.
But players to watch and in general thoughts on PSG.
I feel like it should come as no surprise to anyone that I think the player to watch on PSG. I feel like it's weird. I've talked to other people about this, and they're all like, Jinja is the player to watch. And I'm like, I think Maple is the player to watch, just in terms of both storyline, but also in the context of going up against FlyQuest. I think the way that Maple and Jensen play is very different, but they're both like veteran staples of mid lane. And Maple kind of returning to PSG is a very cool story. I think Maple and Junja working together um,
Yep.
is behind a lot of this team success and is kind of the engine through which this team runs. Um, and so, yeah, I think if there would be a player that I'd point out to watch, it would still be Maple. I'm sure that's a boring answer, but his longevity and like history in the PCS/LMS and also just with PSG overall is also just a really cool story with him returning
Yeah.
to this team, reuniting with Betty. So yeah, that's who I would watch.
Nice. I guess for me, the most. It's interesting that people say Jinja because I felt him off Maokai and Jarvan to be somewhat underwhelming in general. Um, but
Yeah, people are like weirdly high on Jinja.
yeah, I thought
That could also be because one of the people I talked to is Rob, and I think he really just wants Jinja to do well after being stuck on EDG for.
there you go. Not biased. You're not getting called out. Uh, I think yeah, I agree with Maple. For me, the biggest like just for people also to know, yes, PSG was playing at Lost Worlds, but the roster is different.
Mhm.
It's very different. Yeah, so just so everyone is aware. Uh, the other, so I would say that there's that part of it. The other thing that I would talk about with PSG is so Audra's pretty good. Audra and Kiaya, I think, had like a similar situation where it was just like they just win lane, and then I don't
Mhm.
necessarily think they will get that at MSI. Like, I don't think that they will just win lane for free. So you'll have to adapt to like how you're playing with top, how you're playing around top. But Audra is like interesting. I think I would also just pick Maple, but uh, it is what it is. Like PSG are very interesting because they legit will like prioritize these hard in regular season. They legit prioritize these like high prior bot lanes and then would like swap for grubs.
Yep.
They would not stack Drakes. They would not have Drake focus, and then they would always frequently be late to Drakes and then look for picks. I think a lot of people are talking about how much of a threat they are versus Fly. I'm a bit lower on them. I think. Um, I think the teams play very similar, but I do think that Fly has like a slight advantage in the sense that they will like if you are not actually pressuring your bot advantage, I think Fly will just kind of take full control early on
Mhm.
and basically then be able to like slightly rotate around the map better. I think the biggest threat for them is definitely just Maple and Maple's like ability to look for flanks, but it's not even like concerted efforts to set up flanks. I think unironically TF was like one of the better picks for them because it was like
Yep.
you can just press R and then you see the setup on the Drake and then you can look for a flank for free. And a lot of the way they approach retakes wasn't super methodological, but I thought like for example the finals was super fun because it was like Betty versus Sword Art, Karsa versus
Yep.
Maple. Like there's a lot of great storylines there, and I'm excited to see Maple again because especially there were so many conversations about him maybe retiring. So which I think were just kind of made up potentially. I don't know. Maybe there was actually a benefit
We'll
there, but
never know.
I'm excited to see him, and I'm excited to see him in a state where he's playing really well. I think relative to my expectations, I kind of went into this thinking like, ah, these guys are gonna be washed because they were my heroes from so many years ago, and they were bad in LPL, so they're gonna be washed. But they actually, like Maple, actually had a lot of really tight moments. So I am excited to see like this kind of PSG team. I think they'll be fun to watch, if nothing else. But I do have the boring prediction of teams making it to the next round.
Yeah.
Even with these guys will but like I guess like for me like my biggest feeling is if that's the case then you should want to watch these players for the time that they're there and playing. Like you should root for them, you should be excited for them because this to them is like their the biggest opportunity, like where they get their wins, what they the like capstone of their season, and if they can take games, if they can take series, and if they can make it through, then like that is just so cool because we talk about how NA and EU have like cultural and solo queue disadvantages, whatever, but these guys have so many of those things like to a higher level. Um, so it's always very cool to like root for the regional heroes. I think as they show up at the international stage, and I love watching play-ins because you'll always get to see like fun moments, new strategies, teams finding ways to go around to kind of like try to take it down the Goliaths when they're not expected to win.
Mhm.
So, yeah, watch play-in. Woo!
I also think one fun thing that obviously we haven't talked about the next teams because we will in a future episode, but like one fun thing is that from season 3 Worlds, Maple, Impact, and Faker have all been
Yeah.
around since then, and now they're here at 2024 MSI, which is just kind of insane to me, you know? Like Impact has become a staple top laner of LCS. Maple, even with his like LCS and LPL stints, I think is like the premier kind of LMS PCS mid. And then Faker obviously is fucking Faker. So it's kind of cool to see like we talk about the youths a lot, but like there's the trio of 3 old men who were at season 3 Worlds, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, it's very fun. I also like. I will end this episode, if you will, to quote Milky Way, which is, uh, I admire Faker and Xiaohu because longevity is very important to me. So, there you go. Basically, Milky Way went on a philosophical rant about the longevity of certain players and how he's going to be a player who's still playing for 10 years. And his favorite players, people might think that they're washed, but the longevity is what is important. He said this after slamming Weibo, so um, so you can argue that that series
Rip
is
Xiaohu.
not remotely one-sided, but yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thanks so much.
With that, the dog has said it's time.
It's time. The dog is
It's time to end the show. Oh no, he just suddenly started barking. I have no idea.
all right. Any last words
Probably
or
hear
shout
something.
outs? Anything, Colin? Would you like to add?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, didn't we already establish that he's a sad Fnatic fan? Anyway,
Yeah. The Fnatic TS
I think
rematch. He's gonna be depressed.
Yep. Yeah, that's actually what I was gonna say. Is there's also potential for the Fnatic TES rematch, aka the It Starts With Success rematch.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just like I know this is a losing battle in terms of people tuning into MSI, but like I do think play-ins are so valuable, and I always really enjoy watching them. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to just having the tournament start.
If we talk about BO3s again for like the millionth time, and Fearless Draft, we will do so in a future episode when it's more relevant. It's currently not too relevant. Like ultimately, yes, it is relevant because people are talking about it, but we will not actually get to see the impact of it for a bit. So, but if you're interested in our thoughts on BO3, we've talked about them quite a bit before.
Mm-hmm.
I've made a lot of public comments on Fearless because I've actually watched it, which a lot of people making comments have not actually watched Fearless play out. So, hooray!
So we can talk about it at a future
we'll talk
date.
about the future episode. Mm-hmm.
It's in my opinion, it's actually a pretty extensive conversation.
Yeah.
Fearless is because it dovetails into just like what is entertaining and like what do we consider the fabric of a League of Legends game, and like what do we think the devs are looking at in terms of what does champion diversity mean? Like, actually, what it reminds me of? Not to actually have this conversation right now, but do you remember in 2015 when you and I were talking about the champion diversity at that Worlds because they had the mega juggernaut patch, and you brought up the fact that like more champion diversity doesn't necessarily mean a good thing for like the competitiveness or like an even entertainment value of the game.
Yeah.
You wrote an article on it. I think
wrote an article about because the quote the comment that was being made was that more champions have been picked, or there was more champion diversity in general. And I was basically pointing out that yes, there were more like one-off picks, but in terms of like consistently different picks, it was actually a much more refined pool, and it wasn't actually diverse at all. So that was like a
Rip.
slightly different conversation. But you could probably make that same argument about Fearless, where
Yeah.
we're just gonna swap team comps, and then there will be like some more one-off niche picks, but it won't actually lead to more champion diversity. But
Yeah.
I will say,
That was a conversation for another
yeah,
time because it is really interesting to me.
it is interesting. I don't know. I feel like because I've talked about Fearless for entire splits and like in side corners watching NACL, etc. It's like I feel like I've just talked about it ad nauseum, but I'm down to talk about it more. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good one, and we will see you at some point. I don't know, but I'll keep you updated
Curious.
on what the schedules are looking like. So yeah.